A sloth, a donkey, and a curious human. Send a prompt and see what they're doing. One hits record with a question on his mind. Two brothers pick it up, see what they find. Corn takes his time, Herman's got the facts. Back and forth, they never hold back. My weird prompts, come on in, that's where we begin. My weird prompts, glad you're here.
This episode was generated using artificial intelligence. Please verify facts.
Hey, Herman and Corin. Really enjoyed that episode. Enjoyed or thought it was very informative. The one about infant CPR or infant first aid. Always good to get an update on what the guidelines are. And interesting to note that the stage at which you call for help, that there's been a bit of evolution of thought there over time. It made me think of another prompt, as I mentioned, I so often do. The only time I've had to call an ambulance in my life so far, I noticed something that I'd actually love to talk about, because I feel like for this life-saving tech, as much as our conversations are sometimes in the abstract, and I think, we really pick at niche subjects, but they are important, especially for those who want to support the work of the first aid emergency responders to understand how their systems work, and the tech that they use. I feel like has potentially, we always find these strange points of confluence between episodes, and that's sometimes why I ask these prompts. Anyway, to cut to the chase. So I called 911 or 101, and we talked in a previous episode about how emergency dispatch actually works. I mentioned that, we talked in the context of control center setups, but these big dispatch rooms, and they're often actually federated. So you get through to someone, and then we talked about how it's often a warm transfer. In these situations where every second potentially matters, there isn't enough time for the dispatcher to listen to the emergency, classify it, and then repeat the information over to the ambulance crew. So in practice, what happens is a warm transfer in which you're basically patched in. Essentially a conference call is kicked off. And I recall, if I'm not mistaken, that it sounded like, I don't know what systems an ambulance crew uses in the field to talk to a head office. But you know how walkie-talkies have that kind of distinctive sound over the air, like when you just kind of, you hear the beeps of the push-to-talk systems, and just has that kind of certain timbre to the quality. So I remember thinking, wow, this is cool. The dispatcher is literally, I called over the phone, and now the dispatcher is speaking to the unit in the field over what sounds like VHF radio. I presume that's probably what actually happened or was happening. And I'd love to talk about that, because we've talked about SIP, SIP systems for VoIP, and we've talked about how the actual, how telecoms works in practice, GSM-based radio networks. But we haven't talked about this, I think, pretty interesting use case where in certain domains, whether we're talking about first aid or military context, even if this isn't a typical thing we do, or even makes a lot of sense from a networking standpoint, we're not going to wait for the perfect. We have to fuse these different systems together. So whether we're talking, any way, if there's an emergency dispatcher speaking to an ambulance that's in the field in a remote region, we're going to use whatever technology, whatever network is going to be able to relay a message from A to B, and we're not gonna waste those extra 30 seconds. Because that could make the difference between life and death. So I'd love to know exactly how that works, Herman and Corin. Whatever networks we're talking, we have to be specific here. We're talking about VHF, maybe even UHF, I don't know. But whatever networks ambulances are using these days, satellites, all these things have to be basically spliced together in real time in the dispatch context. And we can extrapolate from this very niche field to many others. We can talk about military commands. I think we talked before about how military communications works in practice. Another one of those niche topics I always wondered is, if an army goes into a location that doesn't have good coverage, or even if it did have good cell phone coverage, A, they're not using civilian infrastructure, and B, they have to have a plan for what happens if there is no cell phone coverage. And the answer to that question of what they do is pretty interesting in its own right, deploying their own networks on the fly. But it kind of relates here, because we're talking about a C2 infrastructure, hub and spoke. We have a dispatch center acting as the hub, and any way we can get the calls out to the field, it doesn't matter. We're going to use that technology. So Herman and Corin, this will be a bit of a technical one in the weeds of SIP and telephony, but really interested to know how it works in practice in today's episode of My Word Prompts.
Hey everyone, welcome back to my Weird Prompts. It is February 26th, 2026, and I am Corn. Sitting across from me, surrounded by more signal diagrams and technical manuals than usual, is my brother, Herman Poppleberry.
Hello. It is great to be back in the studio. I have been looking forward to this one all week, Corn. We are diving into the deep end of the electromagnetic spectrum today.
We really are. Today's prompt comes from Daniel, and it is a fascinating look at the technical backbone of emergency dispatch. Daniel is curious about how systems like very high frequency, ultra high frequency, and satellite networks are spliced together in real time. He is looking at this through both medical and military lenses. He specifically asked about the mechanics of warm transfers where every second counts. And honestly, given that Daniel and Hannah had their son Ezra last July, it makes total sense that he is thinking about the reliability of emergency services lately. When you become a parent, you start noticing the infrastructure of safety in a way you never did before.
When you have a young one at home, you start looking at the world through a different lens of infrastructure and safety. And Daniel's background in technology communications means he is not just asking if the ambulance shows up. He wants to know exactly how the packet of voice data travels from the dispatch center to the radio in that ambulance. It is a fascinating question because it touches on one of the most complex integration challenges in modern engineering. We are talking about bridging technologies that were invented in the 1950s with satellite constellations that were launched last month.
It really is a massive puzzle. Most people think of a call to 911 as a simple phone call, but once it hits the dispatch center, it enters a totally different realm. It is not just one network. It is a dozen networks that all speak different languages. So, Herman, let us start with the basics. When a dispatcher is sitting at their console, they are looking at a screen that represents multiple communication channels. How do they actually bridge a phone call from a civilian to a radio frequency used by a first responder?
That is the heart of the matter. The technology that makes this possible is called Radio over Internet Protocol, or RoIP. In the old days, you had physical patches where you would literally plug a cable from one circuit into another, much like an old telephone switchboard operator. But today, it is all digital. The dispatch console acts as a massive software switch. When a call comes in via the public switched telephone network, it is converted into a digital stream. At the same time, the radio networks, whether they are very high frequency or ultra high frequency, are also being fed into the system via gateways.
Okay, so these gateways are the translators. If the dispatcher needs to connect a caller directly to a paramedic in the field, what is actually happening in the software?
The gateway takes the analog or digital radio signal from the field and wraps it in an Internet Protocol packet. This is usually done using something called Session Initiation Protocol, or SIP, which is the same standard used for most modern office phone systems. But here is the tricky part. Radio audio is different from phone audio. Radio uses specific vocoders like the AMBE+2 standard, which are designed to make human speech intelligible even when there is a lot of background noise or signal interference. The gateway has to transcode that radio audio into a format the phone system understands, and it has to do it with almost zero latency. Once everything is in a common digital format, the dispatcher can simply drag and drop one channel onto another on their screen. This creates a bridge. The dispatcher stays in the middle of that bridge, which is where the warm transfer comes in.
I want to dig into that warm transfer concept. Daniel mentioned it specifically. In a medical emergency, the dispatcher does not just say, "Hold on while I transfer you," and then disappear. They stay on the line while they bring the medic or the doctor in. Why is that specific three-way connection so technically demanding?
It is demanding because of the different ways these networks handle audio flow. A telephone call is full duplex, meaning both people can talk and hear at the same time. But many emergency radio systems, especially older, very high-frequency ones, are half duplex. You press a button to talk, and while you are talking, you cannot hear anything. When you bridge those two, you have to manage the audio levels and the switching very carefully. If the caller is screaming while the paramedic is trying to give instructions over the radio, the system has to ensure the paramedic's voice takes priority. This is often handled by something called digital signal processing, or DSP. The system identifies the paramedic's radio key-up and automatically ducks the audio from the caller so the instructions can be heard.
So the system is essentially listening to the audio and deciding which stream is more important in millisecond increments.
Precisely. It is also normalizing the volume. A person calling from a cell phone in a windy parking lot sounds very different from a paramedic speaking into a high-quality tactical radio with noise cancellation. The dispatch system has to level those out so everyone can understand each other. And when we talk about warm transfers, the dispatcher is the conductor. They are holding the caller's hand emotionally while technically managing the link to the field unit. They ensure that the person in the field has all the context before they take over the lead on the call. In 2026, we also have metadata being passed along that bridge. The dispatcher isn't just passing the voice. They are often pushing the caller's GPS coordinates and medical history directly to the paramedic's tablet at the same time the voice bridge is established.
We actually talked about the high-pressure environment of these centers back in episode 542 when we went inside emergency dispatch, but today we are looking even deeper at the hardware. Daniel also mentioned military contexts. Now, in a combat zone or a remote area, you might not have a nice fiber optic line or a cell tower nearby. That is where satellite comes in. How do you integrate a satellite link into this same dispatch loop?
That is where it gets really impressive. Military command and control systems, often called C2, use specialized gateways that can bridge tactical radios like the one soldiers carry with satellite backhaul. If a unit is in a remote valley in a different country, their radio signal might only travel a few miles, but it hits a vehicle-mounted gateway or a portable base station that then beams it up to a satellite constellation. In 2026, we are seeing a lot of this moving toward low Earth orbit constellations like Starlink's Starshield or the updated Iridium Next. That signal travels thousands of miles to a command center, where it is treated just like any other audio input.
But latency has to be a huge issue there, right? If you are bouncing a signal to space and back, that warm transfer is going to have a delay. How do they account for that in a life or death situation?
You hit the nail on the head. Latency is the enemy of seamless communication. In a geostationary satellite link, you might have a delay of 700 milliseconds or more. With low Earth orbit satellites, that is down to maybe 30 or 50 milliseconds, which is much better, but still present. If you are trying to have a real-time conversation between a doctor in a hospital and a medic on a battlefield, that delay can lead to people talking over each other. To solve this, the systems use advanced jitter buffers and echo cancellation. They also use specialized protocols like the Project 25 or P25 standard for digital radio, which is designed to be very robust even when the connection is poor. The system actually stretches or compresses the audio packet slightly to fill in the gaps caused by latency, so the human ear perceives a continuous stream of speech rather than a series of clicks and pops.
It is interesting that the military and civilian worlds are starting to use more of the same underlying technology. It used to be that military tech was decades ahead, but with the explosion of cloud computing and internet protocol-based communication, the gap is closing.
It really is. The big difference today is often just the encryption and the ruggedness of the hardware. A civilian dispatch center is sitting in a climate-controlled building with massive diesel generators for backup, which we discussed in episode 771. A military dispatch center might be in the back of a moving truck or a tent, but the underlying logic of splicing the networks together remains the same. You need a universal translator that can take any waveform, whether it is a frequency-hopping tactical signal or a standard cell phone call, and turn it into a standard digital packet.
I think a common misconception is that these systems are just like a big conference call on a computer, but there is a level of redundancy here that is just staggering. If the internet goes out, the dispatch center does not just stop working.
Right. They have what they call triple redundancy. They have the fiber lines, they have microwave links, which are line-of-sight radio connections between buildings, and they have the direct radio towers. If the dispatch software itself fails, most centers have a fallback to a manual patch panel where they can literally use physical wires to connect the radio base station to a handset. It is all about ensuring that the link between the person in need and the person who can help never breaks. In the military, they use something called PACE planning. It stands for primary, alternate, contingency, and emergency. If the satellite goes down, they drop to high frequency radio. If that fails, they move to something else. The splicing software has to be smart enough to switch between these backhauls without dropping the active bridge.
That makes me think about the actual console the dispatcher uses. They are often managing 10 or 15 different screens or windows. They might have a map, a caller ID system, a medical protocol guide, and then the radio interface. When they perform that warm transfer, are they literally just clicking a button that says bridge?
In modern systems like Motorola's Astro or Harris's Symphony consoles, yes, it is very intuitive. But behind that single click, the software is negotiating the connection between a phone line running on one protocol and a radio channel running on another. It is also recording everything. Every single second of that bridged conversation is archived on a secure server for legal and training purposes. The console also manages talk groups. A dispatcher might be listening to 5 different talk groups at once, and they have to decide which ones to splice together for a specific incident.
Herman, are you there?
Mom, I'm actually recording the show right now. We are right in the middle of a topic.
Oh, I am so sorry, Bubbly. I did not mean to interrupt your important work. I just wanted to remind you that you left your green Tupperware at my house after Shabbat dinner. The one with the lid that fits the small bowl. I put it by the front door, so you do not forget it next time you come over.
Hi, Dorothy. Do not worry, I will make sure he picks it up. He has been complaining about missing that specific bowl all week.
Corn, do not encourage her. Mom, I will call you back in about 20 minutes, okay? We are talking about emergency radios.
Oh, that sounds very complicated. Stay safe, sweetheart. I love you.
Love you too, Mom. Bye.
Laughing. You have to love the timing. Always at the most technical part of the episode. It is like she has a sensor for when you are talking about vocoders and jitterbuffers.
Size. My apologies to the listeners. Where were we? The complexity of the bridge. It is funny though, because even that phone call from my mum is a perfect example of what we are talking about. It came through as a standard voice over LTE call, but if I were a dispatcher, I could have bridged her into a very high-frequency radio net with one click.
Right. We were talking about the dispatcher's console and how it handles the integration of these different streams. I wanted to ask about the hardware at the other end. In the field, does the medic or the soldier know that they are being bridged to a phone call, or does it just sound like another radio transmission to them?
That is a great question. In most cases, it sounds like a normal radio transmission, but there is usually a specific tone or a verbal announcement from the dispatcher. The dispatcher will say something like, "Medic 62, I am patching you through to the caller now." This is a cue for the medic to change their communication style. They know they are no longer just talking to a professional dispatcher using codes and short phrases. They are now talking to a civilian who might be panicked. The audio quality might drop slightly because of the phone link, so the medic knows to speak clearly and listen carefully. On the military side, the bridge is often more transparent, but the operators are trained to recognize the hiss of a satellite link versus the crackle of a local tactical radio.
And that brings us back to the warm transfer. The dispatcher stays on to act as a buffer. If the caller starts giving directions that do not make sense, the dispatcher can step in because they might have the GPS location of the caller on their map, which the medic might not see as clearly in a moving vehicle. It is a collaborative effort.
And in a military context, this is even more critical. Imagine a medevac helicopter coming in to pick up a wounded soldier. The pilot is talking to the ground unit over a tactical radio, but they might also be bridged to a surgeon at a base hospital who is giving advice on how to stabilize the patient before they even land. That bridge involves multiple levels of encryption. You have the ground radio, which might be using a Type 1 encryption, the helicopter's internal intercom, the satellite link to the hospital, and the hospital's internal phone system. All of those have to be synced up perfectly. If the encryption keys do not match at the gateway, the bridge fails.
What about the transition between different types of radio? Daniel mentioned very high frequency and ultra high frequency. For our listeners who might not know, very high frequency is usually better for long distance and open areas because the waves follow the curvature of the Earth better, while ultra high frequency is better for getting through buildings and urban environments because the shorter waves can bounce around obstacles. Does a dispatcher ever have to bridge a very high frequency unit to an ultra high frequency unit?
All the time. In a large-scale emergency, like a multi-story building fire or a major accident on a highway, you might have different agencies on different bands. The police might be on ultra-high frequency while the fire department is on very high frequency. The dispatch center acts as the hub that allows them to talk to each other. They call this interoperability. Without that central integration point, these units would be deaf to each other. They could be standing 10 feet apart and not be able to communicate via radio. This was a major issue during 9/11, and it led to the creation of standards like P25 and the Inter-RF Subsystem Interface, or ISSI, which allows different radio systems from different manufacturers to talk to each other over an Internet Protocol backbone.
That seems like a massive vulnerability if the dispatch center itself is compromised. If the hub goes down, the spokes cannot talk to each other.
It is. That is why there has been a huge push for something called the FirstNet network in the United States and similar systems elsewhere. These are dedicated cellular networks for first responders that provide a common platform for data and voice. But even with FirstNet, the old school radio systems are not going away. They are too reliable. A radio tower will still work when the local cell site is overwhelmed by civilians trying to call their families. So the job of the dispatcher to splice these things together remains the primary way we manage emergencies. In 2026, we are seeing deployable hubs, basically small suitcases that contain a mini dispatch console and a satellite link that can be dropped into a disaster zone to recreate that splicing capability on the fly.
I'm curious about the role of artificial intelligence in this. We are seeing AI integrated into almost everything now. Is it starting to help with this splicing and bridging process?
It is beginning to. There are new systems that use AI to automatically transcribe the bridge conversations in real time. This allows the dispatcher to look back at something the caller said 30 seconds ago without having to ask them to repeat it. There is also AI being used for noise reduction. It can identify the sound of a siren or a helicopter rotor and digitally subtract it from the audio stream, making the human voice much clearer. But the actual decision to bridge or transfer a call is still very much a human one. You want a person making that call, not an algorithm. We are also seeing AI sentiment analysis, where the system flags if a caller's voice indicates extreme shock or if a first responder's voice shows signs of extreme stress, alerting supervisors to provide extra support.
That makes sense. The human element provides the empathy and the situational awareness that, I just cannot match yet. But having those AI tools in the background to clean up the audio or provide transcriptions must be a huge help in reducing the cognitive load on the dispatcher. I can imagine that managing a warm transfer while also trying to type notes and look at a map is incredibly draining.
Think about the mental energy it takes to listen to 3 different audio sources at once, manage a digital map, and give medical instructions. Anything that reduces that load is a win. There is also the cross-patch issue. Sometimes you have 2 different radio channels that need to stay connected for the duration of an incident. The dispatcher sets that up and then has to monitor it to make sure one channel isn't accidentally locking out the other.
So, looking at the practical takeaways for our listeners, first, the reliability of these systems comes from their diversity. They do not rely on just one network. They use everything from old-fashioned radio waves to the latest satellite constellations. Second, the dispatcher is much more than just someone who answers the phone. They are a high-tech network engineer and a conductor of emergency resources.
And third, if you are ever in a situation where you are part of a warm transfer, stay calm and listen to the instructions. The technology is working hard to bring the expert to you, and the dispatcher is there to make sure that connection stays solid. It is a remarkable feat of engineering that we all take for granted until we really need it. We should also mention that in 2026, your phone is doing more than ever to help. Features like advanced mobile location automatically send your high-precision coordinates to the dispatch center the moment you dial 911, which saves the dispatcher from having to ask "Where are you?" and lets them focus on the "What is happening?" part of the bridge.
It really is. I also think there is a lesson here about redundancy in our own lives. While we do not need a dispatch console at home, having multiple ways to communicate during an emergency is just smart. We talked about this in episode 745 regarding cell broadcasts versus apps. Sometimes the simplest, most robust technology is what saves the day. If the cell towers are down, a simple battery-powered radio might be your only link to information.
Very true. And for someone like Daniel, who works in tech, seeing the way these legacy systems are being modernized with Internet Protocol is a great example of how you can build on top of proven infrastructure rather than just tearing it all down and starting over. The very high frequency radio is 50-year-old tech, but when you wrap it in a modern Internet Protocol packet, it becomes part of a cutting-edge 2026 communication suite. It is about the edge devices. The radio at the end of the line hasn't changed much, but the core of the network. The part that does the splicing is now almost entirely software defined.
That is a great point. It is about bridging the old and the new to create something more resilient. Now, before we wrap up, I want to touch on the military side one more time. We mentioned command and control. In those contexts, is there a person acting as a dispatcher, or is it more automated?
There is usually a specialized role called a radio telephone operator or an operations sergeant who performs a similar function to a civilian dispatcher. They sit in a tactical operations center and manage the various nets. A net is just a specific frequency or channel. They have to ensure that the commander has a clear line to the units on the ground, the air support above, and the headquarters back home. It is the same splicing logic, just with much higher stakes and more complicated encryption. They use devices like the Harris Falcon 4 or the Thales SquadNet, which are designed to automatically find the best path for a signal, whether that is bouncing off a nearby truck or going up to a satellite.
It is amazing how much of our modern world depends on these invisible bridges. Whether it is a medic in Jerusalem or a soldier in a remote outpost, the ability to splice these networks together in real time is a fundamental pillar of modern safety. It is the difference between a fragmented response and a unified one.
It really is. And I think we are going to see even more integration with things like wearable sensors in the future. Imagine a medic's heart rate monitor or a soldier's vitals being bridged directly into that same audio stream so the doctor on the other end can see the patient's data while they are talking. We are already seeing the first steps of that with telemedical overlays on dispatch consoles. The dispatcher can see the patient's pulse and oxygen levels in a little window right next to the bridge button.
That is a whole other level of complexity. We will have to save that for a future episode, maybe a deep dive into the Internet of Medical Things. The security implications alone of bridging medical data over radio frequencies would take an hour to unpack.
I would love that. There is so much to explore there, especially with the new quantum-resistant encryption standards they are starting to roll out for these networks.
Well, I think we have covered a lot of ground today. We have looked at radio over Internet Protocol, the role of gateways, the challenges of satellite latency, and the critical importance of the warm transfer. Hopefully, this gives Daniel and all our listeners a better understanding of what happens behind the scenes when they call for help. It is not just a phone call, it is a massive real-time engineering feat.
And Daniel, give Ezra a high five for us. He is lucky to have a dad who is so interested in how the world actually works. By the time Ezra is old enough to have his own phone, these systems will probably be even more seamless, likely using direct-to-cell satellite links as the primary backup for everything.
Definitely. And hey, if you are enjoying my weird prompts, we would really appreciate it if you could leave us a review on Spotify or Apple Podcasts. It genuinely helps the show reach new people who might be as nerdy as we are about emergency dispatch systems and vocoders.
It really does. We love seeing those reviews come in. It makes all the hours of reading technical manuals worth it.
You can find all our past episodes, including the ones we mentioned today about dispatch centers and redundancy, at myweirdprompts.com. We have a full archive there, and if you want to get in touch or send us your own prompt, you can find the contact form on the site or email us at show@myweirdprompts.com. We are always looking for deep dives into the hidden systems of the world.
Also, a quick shout out to Suno. Our show music is generated using their AI, which is a pretty cool piece of tech in its own right. It is another example of how AI is becoming a tool for creators, much like it is becoming a tool for dispatchers.
It is. All right, I think that is a wrap for today. This has been My Weird Prompts. I am Corn.
And I am Herman Poppleberry. I am going to go get my Tupperware now.
Thanks for listening, and we will catch you in the next one.
Stay safe out there. Goodbye.
This episode was generated using Gemini Flash 3. Text-to-speech engine was Chatterbox.
Thanks for listening to our show, My Weird Prompts, where our thoughts go from slow takes to facts on cue. We change and